Meet Ernest Wycliffe, a 68-year-old retiree with more charm than sense. Lonely and desperate to reclaim his youth, he sinks his entire pension into the promises of the Romance Revival Academy, a sketchy love coaching program run by a flamboyant self-proclaimed love guru named Dante Valentino. The comedy of Ernest fumbling through bizarre love lessons soon spirals into heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. What unfolds will leave you laughing, gasping, and sobbing. Ernest Wycliffe was no stranger to the aching silence of an empty house. At 68, his days had become an unchanging loop of bland routines. Morning tea, a stroll to the park to feed the pigeons, and hours of channel surfing punctuated only by the occasional nod to his chatty neighbor, Mrs. Penelope Hawthorne. She often remarked that Ernest was too young to live like a hermit, but Ernest shrugged off her well-meaning advice. "The heart has a retirement age too, Penelope," he'd say with a wry smile. What Penelope didn't know was that Ernest's loneliness wasn't entirely by choice. Losing his wife, Margaret, 5 years ago had left him untethered. The grief was still there, heavy and omnipresent, but now it mingled with something new, a longing for connection, for laughter, for love. But where does a man his age even begin? His grandchildren teased him about apps like Tinder and Bumble, but the idea of swiping through strangers' faces filled him with dread. One fateful evening, as Ernest sat in his favorite armchair scrolling through gardening forums, a brightly colored ad popped up on his screen. "Transform your love life in 30 days. Guaranteed," it screamed with a picture of a sharply dressed man flashing a confident smile and holding a bouquet of roses. Intrigued, Ernest clicked. The website was a kaleidoscope of promises. Reignite your charisma. Captivate women of any age. Proven results or your money back. Beneath the bold claims was a video introduction by Dante Valentino, the self-proclaimed world's greatest love coach. Dante was everything Ernest was not: bold, flamboyant, and oozing charisma. His perfectly coiffed hair, sparkling teeth, and Italian silk suits seemed almost otherworldly. "My friends," Dante purred into the camera, "love is not about age, looks, or money. It's about strategy. With my program, you'll unleash your inner Casanova and conquer the world of romance. Trust me, you've got nothing to lose but your loneliness." It sounded ridiculous, even to Ernest. And yet, something about Dante's confidence struck a chord. Was it possible to reignite his dormant charm? To find someone who'd sit across the table from him at dinner and share in the warmth of a smile? Ernest wrestled with the decision for days before finally caving. "What have I got to lose?" he muttered, reaching for his wallet. The initial fee was steep, $5,000 for the premium Love Renaissance package. But Ernest reasoned that it was an investment in himself, in his happiness. The seminar was held at a local hotel ballroom the following weekend. Ernest arrived early, dressed in his best and only suit, clutching a notepad like a nervous schoolboy. The room was filled with men of all ages, from fresh-faced 20-somethings to gray-haired retirees like himself. Some looked eager, others skeptical, but all of them sat in rapt attention as Dante Valentino burst onto the stage amidst a cloud of theatrical smoke and blaring pop music. "Welcome, gentlemen," Dante bellowed, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace the entire audience. "Tonight, you begin your transformation from average to irresistible." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ernest found himself swept up in the energy, his doubts momentarily silenced. The first session was a whirlwind of absurdity. Dante's lessons ranged from posture and eye contact to something he called the power of the wink. He demonstrated on a bewildered volunteer, winking so aggressively that it looked more like a facial spasm. The audience roared with laughter, and even Ernest couldn't suppress a chuckle. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start he needed. But as the seminar went on, the cracks began to show. Dante's advice grew increasingly bizarre. "Confidence is key," he declared, strutting across the stage. "But so is mystery. Always carry a prop, something intriguing, like a vintage pocket watch or a pineapple." The crowd hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or take notes. Ernest scribbled dutifully, though he couldn't imagine lugging a pineapple to a first date. Then came the speed dating exercise, a chaotic affair that involved rotating chairs and blaring music. Ernest found himself paired with a much younger woman who looked equal parts amused and horrified. "So," he stammered, clutching his notepad like a life preserver. "Do you, come here often?" She giggled politely before the buzzer signaled the next rotation. By the end of the day, Ernest was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. For all its absurdity, the seminar had jolted him out of his comfort zone. He wasn't sure if he'd learned anything useful, but he couldn't deny that it felt good to laugh, to interact, to try. What Ernest didn't realize was that he was already in too deep. Dante's promises would soon unravel, exposing a web of deceit and greed that would leave Ernest questioning everything, including himself. But for now, as he walked home under the glow of streetlights, he allowed himself to dream of a brighter future, blissfully unaware of the storm looming ahead. Ernest Wycliffe had always considered himself a man of reason, but Dante Valentino's Love Renaissance program was pushing him to his limits. Over the following weeks, the classes only grew more outlandish. Ernest attended every single session, determined to see his investment through. After all, he had spent his entire pension on this, and quitting now would be akin to admitting he had been duped. That was a blow his pride wasn't ready to take. The sessions were a blend of theatrical absurdity and questionable wisdom. Dante, ever the showman, strutted into each class as though he were performing on Broadway. One day, he arrived wearing a velvet cape and wielding a cane topped with a golden heart. "Gentlemen," he announced dramatically, "today's lesson is about owning the room. Confidence isn't just a trait, it's an aura, a spell you cast on everyone you meet." Ernest, who had never so much as raised his voice in public, found the concept daunting. But Dante had a solution for that. The class was instructed to practice power entrances by walking into a room, striking a pose and shouting, "I'm here, ladies!" Ernest couldn't bring himself to participate until Dante singled him out. "Mr. Wycliffe, my dear friend, you're up. Show us your inner tiger." Reluctantly, Ernest shuffled to the front of the room. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and hesitated. "Come on, Ernest," someone called out. Swallowing his nerves, Ernest stepped forward, threw open his arms, and declared, "I'm here, ladies." The room erupted in laughter and applause. It was humiliating, yet oddly exhilarating. For a brief moment, Ernest felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: confidence. But the lessons didn't stop there. Dante's next assignment was to create a signature move, something that would make them unforgettable. It could be a dance, a gesture, or even a phrase, Dante explained. When people think of you, they should remember your spark. Ernest, in a rare burst of creativity, decided on a boo, followed by a playful tip of an imaginary hat. It felt silly, but it also made him laugh, a rare and welcome sensation. Outside of class, Ernest began applying Dante's lessons in real life, with mixed results. On one occasion, he attempted to own the room at his local coffee shop by walking in with exaggerated confidence and winking at the barista. The poor girl looked so startled that Ernest immediately apologized and tipped her $20. Another time, he tried his signature move at the park, bowing and tipping his imaginary hat to a group of women playing cards. They burst into laughter, and one of them remarked, "At least he's got charm." Despite these small victories, doubts continued to creep in. Dante's methods were undeniably bizarre, and Ernest began to wonder if he was the only one questioning their effectiveness. During one particularly ridiculous class, where they were instructed to practice seductive fruit-eating techniques using bananas, Ernest couldn't hold back any longer. "Dante," he asked, raising his hand, "how exactly is this supposed to help us find meaningful connections?" Dante paused, clearly taken aback. The room fell silent as every pair of eyes turned to Ernest. For a moment, Ernest regretted speaking up, but then Dante broke into a wide grin. "Ah, an excellent question, Mr. Wycliffe. You see, romance is an art form, and art requires practice. This exercise isn't just about fruit. It's about confidence, presentation, and learning to embrace your playful side." The explanation didn't satisfy Ernest, but he nodded politely and went along with the exercise. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. He began to notice things he hadn't before: the exorbitant price of the program, the vague and often contradictory advice, and the fact that Dante seemed more interested in flaunting his wealth than actually helping his clients. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session on the power of mystery props, which involved carrying around items like pocket watches and snow globes, Ernest found himself sitting alone in his living room, staring at the pile of notes he had taken over the weeks. The question gnawed at him. Was he really learning anything useful, or was he just chasing an illusion? As the weeks went on, Ernest's skepticism grew. He began talking to some of the other participants during breaks, and he discovered that many of them shared his doubts. "I spent my savings on this," admitted a man named Charlie, a middle-aged mechanic with a kind smile. "But all I've got so far is a collection of weird props and a lot of confused looks from women." "I hear you," said another participant, a retired schoolteacher named Victor. "I tried the pineapple thing and it just made me look like a lunatic. My granddaughter hasn't stopped laughing about it." Their candid conversations were both comforting and alarming. Ernest realized he wasn't alone in his doubts, but he also felt a growing sense of responsibility. He had to figure out the truth about Dante's program, not just for himself, but for everyone who had invested their hard-earned money in it. As the final week of the program approached, Ernest resolved to confront Dante. He didn't know what he was looking for: answers, an apology, or perhaps just a shred of honesty. What he didn't realize was that the truth he was about to uncover would shake him to his core and set him on a path he never could have imagined. Ernest walked into the final week of Dante's program with an uneasy determination. The ballroom, once filled with a contagious energy, now felt more like a stage for a poorly executed play. He scanned the room, noticing the growing weariness in his fellow participants' eyes. The initial excitement had faded, replaced by a collective sense of doubt. Dante, of course, remained unfazed. He sauntered onto the stage with his signature flair, dressed in a sequined blazer that sparkled under the spotlights. "Gentlemen, welcome to your final transformation," he announced, his voice booming with confidence. "By now, you've learned the secrets of charisma, mystery, and allure. Today, we unlock the ultimate key to love, the art of storytelling." Ernest raised an eyebrow. Storytelling? He glanced around, noticing a few skeptical expressions among the crowd. "Love is a narrative," Dante continued. "Women don't just fall for a man. They fall for the story he tells. Your job is to craft a tale so compelling, so irresistible, that it leaves them enchanted." The day's exercises revolved around creating romantic origin stories. Dante instructed the participants to pair up and practice telling fabricated tales about how they had met their hypothetical partners. Ernest found himself partnered with Victor, the retired schoolteacher. "So," Victor said, scratching his head, "we're just supposed to make stuff up." "Apparently," Ernest replied, rolling his eyes. "This is starting to feel like an improv class." Victor chuckled, and the two men began their exercise. Ernest crafted a story about meeting a mysterious woman while rescuing a stray cat from a tree. Victor went with a tale about bumping into his fictional soulmate at a bookstore while reaching for the same poetry collection. The stories were absurd, but they provided a rare moment of levity amidst the program's chaos. As the session continued, Ernest noticed something unusual. Dante seemed distracted, glancing frequently at his phone and slipping backstage more often than usual. When he returned, his usual charisma felt forced, his smile strained. It was as if the polished veneer he had maintained so carefully was starting to crack. During a break, Ernest decided to investigate. He approached Charlie, the mechanic, who had been one of the first to voice his doubts. "Charlie," Ernest began, lowering his voice, "have you noticed anything off about Dante lately?" Charlie nodded. "Yeah, I've been wondering the same thing. He's been acting strange, and I overheard him on a call earlier. Something about a deadline and needing more funds. It didn't sound good." Ernest's curiosity deepened. He decided to dig further. That evening, armed with little more than determination and an outdated laptop, he began researching Dante Valentino. At first, he found the usual glossy promotional materials, videos, testimonials, and social media posts showcasing Dante's lavish lifestyle. But as he delved deeper, cracks began to emerge. A forum thread titled "Beware the Love Guru Scam" caught his attention. The posts were filled with complaints from former clients who claimed to have been deceived by Dante. One comment stood out. "He promises transformation, but delivers nothing but debt and humiliation. Stay away." The words sent a chill down Ernest's spine. Fueled by a mix of anger and determination, Ernest continued his investigation. He discovered that Dante's real name was Daniel Valenzuela, a former salesman who had reinvented himself as a love coach. His programs, it seemed, followed a predictable pattern: flashy marketing, exorbitant fees, and vague advice. The more Ernest uncovered, the more certain he became that Dante was running a scam. The next morning, Ernest shared his findings with Victor and Charlie. Their reactions mirrored his own, a mix of disbelief, frustration, and a growing resolve to take action. "We can't let him get away with this," Victor said, his voice firm. "He's preying on people's vulnerabilities." The trio decided to confront Dante during the day's session. As the participants gathered in the ballroom, Ernest felt a knot of tension in his stomach. He had never been one for confrontation, but this felt too important to ignore. Dante began the session with his usual theatrics, but Ernest interrupted him mid-sentence. "Excuse me, Dante," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Or should I say, Daniel Valenzuela?" The room fell silent. Dante's confident facade faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, his smile tight. "I think you do," Ernest replied, holding up a printed copy of the forum thread. "This is who you really are, isn't it? A con artist who preys on people's hopes and dreams." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Dante's expression darkened. "This is a baseless accusation," he said, his voice losing its usual charm. "I've helped countless people find love and confidence." "Then why are there so many complaints about your program?" Charlie chimed in, his tone sharp. "Why do you keep raising the fees and offering nothing but nonsense?" The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, Dante looked genuinely rattled. "I think we're done here," he said abruptly, turning to leave. But Ernest wasn't finished. "You owe us an explanation," he called after him. "And if you walk away now, you're only proving that everything we've said is true." Dante hesitated, his shoulders stiffening. For a moment it seemed like he might turn around, but instead he strode out of the ballroom without another word. The participants sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. It was Charlie who finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of anger and determination, "I guess it's up to us to make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." The room erupted into a flurry of conversations as the participants began sharing their stories and discussing their next steps. For the first time, Ernest felt a sense of solidarity among the group. They had been deceived, but they weren't powerless. Together, they would find a way to expose Dante and reclaim their dignity. As Ernest left the ballroom that day, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also a newfound sense of purpose. He had spent so long searching for love and validation, only to realize that the most important transformation was the one within himself. And while the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't walking it alone. After Dante's abrupt exit, the air in the ballroom was electric. What had once been a room full of hesitant men now buzzed with indignation and determination. For Ernest, it was a strange shift. The man who had felt so out of place only weeks ago now found himself stepping into a role he never imagined: a leader. "All right, everyone," Ernest said, standing in front of the group. His voice, though shaky at first, gained strength as he continued. "We've all been taken for a ride, but that doesn't mean we can't do something about it. This isn't just about getting our money back. It's about making sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." The group murmured in agreement, and soon a plan began to take shape. They would gather evidence of Dante's deception: emails, receipts, recordings of his seminars, anything that could prove he was running a scam. Victor, the retired schoolteacher, offered to draft a formal complaint to the authorities. Charlie, the mechanic, suggested reaching out to local news outlets to share their story. As they worked together, a surprising camaraderie began to form. The men who had once sat in silence, separated by their individual insecurities, now laughed and shared their experiences. For Ernest, it was a revelation. He had spent so much time searching for connection, yet here it was, growing out of an unexpected and unfortunate situation. Later that evening, as Ernest walked home, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his perspective had changed. When he first joined Dante's program, he had been consumed by a desire to find love, to fill the void left by his wife's passing. But now, he realized that love wasn't something that could be bought or taught. It was something that grew naturally, often in the most unexpected places. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Ernest and the others worked tirelessly to compile their evidence against Dante. They met in coffee shops and living rooms, poring over documents and piecing together the puzzle of Dante's operation. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Dante's deception ran deep. He had scammed countless people, leaving a trail of debt and broken dreams in his wake. But amidst the seriousness of their mission, there was also laughter. The men joked about the absurdity of Dante's lessons, reenacting some of the more ridiculous exercises with exaggerated flair. Ernest found himself laughing harder than he had in years, the weight of his loneliness lifting bit by bit. One evening, as they gathered at Victor's house to finalize their complaint, Charlie brought out a bottle of whiskey. "To reclaiming our dignity," he said, raising his glass. The toast was met with cheers and laughter, and for the first time in weeks, Ernest felt a deep sense of peace. Their efforts finally culminated in a meeting with a local journalist, Maria Stevens, who had taken an interest in their story. Maria listened intently as they shared their experiences, her pen flying across her notepad. "This is exactly the kind of story people need to hear," she said. "It's not just about exposing Dante. It's about showing people that it's okay to take risks, even if they don't always pay off." As Maria prepared to publish their story, the group's sense of accomplishment grew. But for Ernest, there was something more. He had spent so much of his life avoiding risk, afraid of failure or rejection. Yet here he was, surrounded by new friends, standing up for what he believed in. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn, but one he was grateful for nonetheless. When the story finally went live, it made waves. Local news stations picked it up, and Dante's name quickly became synonymous with fraud. People came forward with their own stories, adding to the mountain of evidence against him. Within weeks, authorities launched an investigation, and Dante, now Daniel, was forced to face the consequences of his actions. For Ernest, the outcome was bittersweet. While he was glad to see justice served, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness for the man who had once seemed so confident and charismatic. "I wonder what went wrong for him," Ernest mused one evening as he and Victor walked through the park. "Maybe he believed his own lies," Victor replied. "Or maybe he just didn't know any other way to survive." Ernest nodded, contemplating Victor's words. It was a sobering thought, but one that didn't diminish his sense of accomplishment. He had taken a risk, fallen for a scam, and come out the other side stronger for it. And while his journey wasn't over, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As the weeks turned into months, the group continued to meet, their shared experience forging a bond that went beyond their initial purpose. They started a weekly poker night, complete with Charlie's homemade chili and Victor's endless supply of bad jokes. Ernest, for his part, brought cookies from the local bakery, a small but meaningful gesture that spoke to his newfound sense of belonging. One evening, as they sat around the table, laughing and trading stories, Ernest realized something profound. He had spent so much time searching for love in the form of a romantic partner, but what he had found instead was a different kind of love, the kind that comes from friendship, from community, from shared purpose. And in that moment, surrounded by his newfound family, Ernest felt something he hadn't felt in years: whole. As weeks turned into months, Ernest found himself settling into a new rhythm. The aftermath of Dante's exposure had left a mark on everyone, but the camaraderie forged in that shared experience endured. The weekly poker nights became a highlight of Ernest's routine, a far cry from the quiet solitude that had once defined his days. On one brisk autumn evening, Ernest arrived at Charlie's house for their usual gathering, carrying a fresh batch of cookies from the bakery. The air was filled with the rich aroma of chili simmering on the stove and the sound of Victor's laughter echoing from the living room. For Ernest, these moments felt like a second chance, not at love, but at life itself. "Ernest, my man," Charlie greeted him at the door, clapping him on the back. "You're just in time. Victor's about to tell us his famous worst date ever story again." Ernest chuckled, stepping inside. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The evening unfolded with its usual mix of laughter and light-hearted banter, but as the night wore on and the poker game wound down, Ernest found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just about exposing Dante or reclaiming his dignity. It was about rediscovering himself. After the others had gone home, Ernest lingered for a moment, helping Charlie tidy up. "You know," he said, stacking empty plates, "I never thought I'd say this, but losing my pension to that scam might have been the best thing that ever happened to me." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement, Ernest." Ernest smiled. "Don't get me wrong. I'd love to have my money back, but if it weren't for that mess, I wouldn't have met all of you, and I wouldn't have realized how much I was missing." Charlie nodded, clinking their glasses together. "Here's to turning lemons into lemonade." As Ernest walked home under the glow of streetlights, he felt a sense of contentment that had eluded him for years. The streets were quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and Ernest allowed himself to savor the stillness. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't rushing to fill a void. He was simply living. But life, as Ernest would soon learn, has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. A week later, during one of his routine walks through the park, Ernest noticed a woman sitting on a bench, painting the autumn scenery. Her brushstrokes were deliberate, her focus intense, and Ernest found himself drawn to her artistry. Not wanting to disturb her, he sat on a nearby bench and watched as she brought the canvas to life. After a while, the woman glanced up and caught him looking. She smiled warmly. "I hope I'm not disturbing your peace," she said. "Not at all," Ernest replied, returning her smile. "It's nice to see someone appreciating the beauty of this place. Most people just pass through without noticing." She laughed softly, setting her brush down. "It's my favorite spot. There's something about the way the light filters through the trees this time of year." Ernest hesitated for a moment before introducing himself. "I'm Ernest, by the way." "Rosalind," she replied, extending a paint-streaked hand. "Nice to meet you." Over the next few weeks, Ernest and Rosalind began to see each other regularly at the park. Their conversations started out light, discussions about art, the weather, and their shared love of the outdoors. But as time went on, they delved deeper, sharing stories of loss, resilience, and the unexpected turns life had taken. Rosalind, it turned out, was a widow like Ernest. Her husband had passed away years ago, and painting had become her way of processing her grief. "It's funny," she said one day, her gaze distant, "how something so painful can lead to something so beautiful. I don't think I'd be the person I am today if I hadn't gone through that." Ernest nodded, understanding her sentiment all too well. "I used to think I was just waiting out the rest of my life," he admitted, "but meeting you, and the others, has made me realize there's still so much left to experience." Their friendship blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Rosalind began attending the poker nights, quickly becoming a beloved member of the group. Her sharp wit and artistic perspective added a new dynamic to their gatherings, and Ernest found himself looking forward to her company more and more. One evening, as they walked home together after a particularly lively poker night, Rosalind turned to Ernest and said, "You know, I think you've got quite the story to tell." Ernest laughed. "What, you mean my misadventures with Dante and his love-coaching scam?" Rosalind nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Exactly. You should write about it. People need to hear stories like yours, about resilience, about finding joy in unexpected places." Ernest considered her suggestion, the idea taking root in his mind. "Maybe I will," he said, "if only to remind myself how far I've come." The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of purpose. Ernest began jotting down his thoughts, recounting the ups and downs of his journey with a mix of humor and heart. Writing became a way for him to reflect, to process, and to celebrate the life he was rebuilding. Through it all, Rosalind remained a constant presence, a reminder that even in the aftermath of heartache, there's room for new beginnings. And as Ernest sat at his desk one evening, pen in hand, he realized something profound. His story wasn't just about falling for a scam. It was about redemption, growth, and the beauty of human connection. And in that moment, Ernest felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope for the future. Ernest had always believed that life offered few second chances, but as he stood before a crowd of strangers clutching a copy of his newly published memoir, he realized just how wrong he had been. The small bookstore was packed, its shelves a cozy backdrop to an event that Ernest could hardly believe was real. His book, titled Love, Lies, and Linguine: How I Lost My Pension But Found Myself, had started as a suggestion from Rosalind. What began as a therapeutic exercise turned into a labor of love, a story he hoped would make people laugh, reflect, and maybe even inspire them to take a leap of faith. "Thank you all for coming," Ernest said, his voice steady despite the fluttering nerves in his stomach. He scanned the room, spotting familiar faces: Victor, Charlie, and, of course, Rosalind, who sat front and center, her warm smile grounding him. "When I first started writing this book, I wasn't sure anyone would want to read the ramblings of a man who fell for one of the most ridiculous scams in history. But what I've come to realize is that this story isn't about the scam. It's about what came after." The crowd chuckled, and Ernest felt his confidence grow. He read an excerpt from the chapter where he attempted to own the room at a coffee shop, complete with a wink and a $20 tip for a bewildered barista. The room erupted in laughter, and Ernest couldn't help but join in. Sharing these moments, both embarrassing and transformative, felt like reclaiming them, turning them into something meaningful. After the reading, Ernest signed copies of his book, each interaction a reminder of how far he had come. One woman, a widow in her 60s, thanked him with tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "It reminded me that it's never too late to start again." Ernest smiled, squeezing her hand. "It's never too late," he agreed, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in his heart. When the event ended, the group gathered at the local diner to celebrate. Rosalind raised her glass of sparkling cider. "To Ernest," she said, her voice full of pride, "for turning a disaster into a masterpiece." "Here, here," the others chimed in, clinking glasses and diving into plates of pie and coffee. The laughter flowed as freely as the conversation, and Ernest felt a swell of gratitude for these people who had become his family. As the night wore on, Ernest and Rosalind found themselves walking home together, the crisp night air filled with the hum of crickets. "You know," Rosalind said, "I think this is just the beginning for you." Ernest glanced at her, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Maybe it is," he replied, "but I couldn't have done it without you." Rosalind smiled, slipping her arm through his. "We've both come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," Ernest said, pausing to take in the moment. The moonlight cast a silver glow over the park, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "And I wouldn't change a thing." In the months that followed, Ernest's book gained traction, resonating with readers who saw themselves in his story. He was invited to speak at events, sharing not just the hilarity of his experience but also the lessons he had learned about resilience, community, and the power of human connection. Through it all, Rosalind remained by his side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. She encouraged him to embrace these opportunities, to step fully into the life he had rediscovered. And Ernest, once hesitant and unsure, found himself saying yes to things he never imagined, traveling to new places, meeting new people, and even hosting a podcast that explored life's unexpected detours. But amidst all the change, Ernest never lost sight of what mattered most. Every week he returned to his friends at poker night, where the laughter was loud, the chili was spicy, and the stories were endless. Those evenings were a reminder of where his journey had begun, and of the people who had walked it with him. One night, as the group gathered around the table, Victor raised a toast. "To Ernest," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "for proving that it's never too late to rewrite your story." Ernest smiled, raising his own glass. "And to all of you," he replied, his voice steady and full of gratitude, "for reminding me that the best stories are the ones we create together." The room erupted in cheers, and for a moment Ernest let himself take it all in, the warmth of friendship, the joy of shared purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. As the night wore on and the group began to disperse, Ernest walked Rosalind home, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. When they reached her door, she turned to him with a smile. "You've come a long way, Ernest Wycliffe," she said, her voice soft and full of affection. "So have you," he replied, taking her hand, "and I think the best is still ahead." Rosalind nodded, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I think so too." And as Ernest walked back to his own home, the stars scattered above him like glittering promises, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from knowing that, whatever happens, he's ready. Because life, Ernest realized, isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about what we do after. And as he closed his door that night, he knew one thing for sure. He was ready for whatever came next.